ever get the feeling things are changing faster and faster these days? I mean,
Oh.
one minute that new phone is all the rage, next minute it's practically a museum piece. And it's not just tech, right? Fashion, music, even what we consider healthy seems to change by the week.
Right. It's like trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly. And get this, that same speed of change, it's shaking up the political landscape too. We're seeing voting blocks that, well, we used to think were predictable, suddenly becoming anything but,
Yeah, it's definitely keeping things interesting.
to say the least. So today, we're doing a deep dive into one of the biggest head scratchers out there, why some young men and blue-collar workers seem to be, well, let's just say less than thrilled with the Democratic Party these days.
It's a trend that's got a lot of people talking.
For sure. And to guide our deep dive today, we're looking at a commentary piece by Larry Kudlow, published in Fox Business just last week on October 15th.
Ah, October surprise is always good for keeping us on our toes.
Tell me about it. And Kudlow doesn't waste any time. He jumps right in, saying it all boils down to, you guessed it, the economy.
Yeah, his argument is that these voters are feeling the pinch, higher prices on everything, that feeling that the American dream is slipping away. He particularly points to rising rents as a major pain point. And to illustrate this whole economic anxiety thing, he does this comparison, right? Manufacturing job growth under Trump versus Biden-Harris.
And he throws out some numbers to make his point.
Oh, yeah, he does. Says something like 450,000 manufacturing jobs were added during Trump's term before the pandemic, compared to, 187,000 at the same point in Biden-Harris's term.
Big difference.
Right. And that's Kudlow's whole point. That difference, he says, makes Trump look like, like the hopeful candidate, the guy who represents a brighter economic future.
Yeah.
But here's where things get really interesting. He goes on to talk about tariffs. It actually suggests that, get this, they might be a selling point for these voters.
Really? Tariffs? That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, this is where it gets kind of tricky. You see, economists, they often see tariffs as potentially inflationary, right? Because they can drive up the cost of goods. Right. But Kudlow's suggesting that for a lot of people, especially those without a college degree, they connect the lack of, crazy inflation during the Trump years with his use of tariffs.
Yeah.
It's like they see it as a form of protectionism, a way to safeguard American jobs and industries.
So, like, those tariffs are a shield holding back a flood of competition from overseas.
Exactly.
But wait, don't tariffs also mean higher prices for consumers?
Well, there you go. It's a classic example of how an economic policy can have, positive and negative effects all at the same time. In the short term, yeah, tariffs, they can protect certain industries, maybe even help create jobs in those sectors.
Which plays right into that whole bringing back manufacturing jobs message we hear so much about.
Exactly. But, and there's always a but, right, those tariffs, they can also mean consumers have to pay more for stuff, and not just, luxury items. We're talking everyday goods. And then there's the whole thing about other countries slapping retaliatory tariffs on U.S. goods, and that can hurt different parts of the economy.
Right. It's like one policy can trigger this whole chain reaction of unintended consequences.
Exactly.
Which makes this deep dive all the more interesting, right? I mean, Kudlow is bringing up a point of view you don't always hear in the mainstream media.
He is. And it highlights how complicated this whole issue really is. Because if he's right, if voters are putting what they see as economic strength, stability, ahead of everything else, well, that could completely change how candidates run their campaigns, what they promise to do if elected.
It'd be like the whole economic playing field just got a major makeover, and now everyone's got to figure out the new rules of the game.
That's a great way to put it. But remember, this is just one perspective, Kudlow's. There are other factors at play here, things that might be influencing how people vote.
Oh, absolutely. So let's shift gears a bit and explore some of those other factors.
It's interesting. Kudlow, he kind of paints this picture of a working-class coalition that's, rallying around Trump, drawn in by this idea of an economic comeback.
The whole Make America Great Again message.
Exactly. And he lists all these different groups, Black, Hispanic, Asian American, white voters. But he keeps coming back to young men, saying they're like the key to this whole thing.
Yeah.
But is it really that cut and dry? I don't know.
It's a compelling narrative, I'll give him that. This idea that all these different people are finding common ground in economic anxiety. But you're right, people are complicated. It's rarely just one thing that determines how they vote.
Right. It's like saying everyone who shops at, Whole Foods votes the same way.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some overlap in line, like lifestyle or whatever. But It's a bit of a stretch to think everyone fits neatly into that box.
Totally. And those kind of assumptions can be dangerous, you know? They
Yeah.
oversimplify things, prevent us from having real conversations about these complicated issues. Like, economics matter for sure, but what about all the social and cultural changes happening at the same time? How did those fit into all of this?
It's like trying to solve a puzzle, but with half the pieces missing.
Kudlow barely even mentions those things. It's almost like he's saying, just show people a path to a fatter paycheck, and everything else will just magically fall into place.
Yeah, like economics is the only thing that matters.
Right. But we're living in a time where cultural issues, identity, even the very idea of what the American dream means, it's all being debated, right?
Yeah.
Hard to imagine those things not playing a role when people step into that voting booth.
Exactly. And to just reduce everything down to like, it's the economy, stupid, that misses a huge chunk of the picture.
Yeah.
People aren't robots, right? We don't just make decisions based on our bank accounts. Our values, what we believe, our cultural identities, all of that gets factored in too.
It's like we each have this internal algorithm, and it's weighing all these different factors to calculate our political choices.
Perfectly said. And for some people, those social, cultural values, they might actually carry more weight than just like economic fears.
Which brings up a whole other point, right? Economic anxiety itself, it can come from a lot of different places. Kudlow, he focuses a lot on job creation, bringing back manufacturing jobs, the whole tariff thing we talked about. But what about automation? Like, no one's talking about the elephant in the room.
The robot revolution. Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Feels like every day there's a new article about AI coming for our jobs.
Right. And that fear of being replaced, of your skills becoming obsolete, that's a real concern for a lot of people. And it doesn't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican.
It really doesn't. It cuts across all those traditional party lines.
It makes you wonder, even if we did bring back all those manufacturing jobs like Kudlow wants, will those jobs even exist in 10, 20 years? Will they require a completely different skill set? It's not just about how many jobs there are, but like what kind of jobs are we talking about? And will they even be around in the future?
It's the uncertainty that really gets to people. Not knowing what the future holds, that's a major driver of anxiety. And it's something politicians, I don't care what side of the aisle they're on, they're going to have to address.
Right. Because how do you campaign on a promise of economic security when the very nature of work is changing so rapidly? It's a tough sell, for sure.
And you know what else Kudlow doesn't really touch on? Education. Retraining programs. Like, if some jobs are disappearing because of automation, globalization, whatever, how do we give people the skills they need to succeed in this new economy?
It's like we need to build a bridge from the old way of doing things to this new reality. And that bridge needs to be strong enough to carry people through all these changes.
Exactly. We can't just leave people stranded. And building that bridge, well, it requires us to understand what's happening. Technological disruption, global competition, the future of work. It's complicated.
So we've got these economic anxieties swirling around us, maybe made worse by all this automation and globalization. But then we've also got all these social and cultural shifts happening at the same time. It's like trying to juggle like 5 different things at once.
And that's what makes analyzing all of this so difficult and so interesting. Because it's not just about numbers, right? It's about understanding people, their hopes, fears, what they want out of life. That's what shapes their choices, including who they vote for.
It's about understanding the human stories behind all the headlines. It's like we're trying to take a picture of something that won't sit still. It's a moving target. These demographic shifts, they're happening right now, and it's this whole mix of things. Economic anxieties, what's going on socially, all this tech disruption. It's a lot to process.
One thing that really struck me about Kudlow's take on all this was how much he focuses on economics.
Yeah.
Like, it's the only thing that matters. And sure, it's a huge factor, obviously. But I keep coming back to this question. Are we missing something by not talking more about the social and cultural changes that are happening at the same time? Where do those fit in?
Right. Like, he barely even mentions those issues. It's like he's saying if you can just show voters a clear path to a better paycheck, the rest will just sort itself out.
Right.
But I don't know, does it really work that way? I mean, think about it. We're living in a time when people are arguing about everything. Cultural issues, identity politics, heck, even the American dream itself is up for debate. So to think those things don't affect how people vote, I don't buy it.
Me neither. It's way too simplistic. To say it all boils down to economics is to ignore like this whole other layer of what's going on. People are more than just walking calculators. We don't make decisions based solely on our bank accounts.
Thankfully.
Right? Our values, our beliefs, our cultural identities, all that stuff plays a role too.
It's like that internal algorithm we were talking about. It's not just crunching numbers, it's taking into account all these other factors to figure out our political choices.
Exactly. And for some people, those social and cultural values, those are the things that really matter. More than just worrying about their wallets, you know what I mean?
Totally. Which actually brings us full circle in a way. Because if Kudlow is right, and economic anxiety really is driving these big political shifts, well, then what does that mean for both parties going forward? Like, are we going to see them shift gears, focus more on those bread and butter issues?
Be a good question.
Will they move away from all the identity politics stuff and try to appeal to voters with this more, I don't know, practical economic message?
Yeah, will we see a return to pragmatism? It's hard to
Yeah.
say for sure.
It really is. But one thing's for sure, it'll be fascinating to see how it all plays out.
Absolutely.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive, but hopefully we've given you some food for thought. Remember, there's no easy answers when it comes to understanding these big societal shifts. It's messy, complicated, and always changing. And that's what makes it so interesting to unpack. Thanks for joining us.